Trent used to believe there were only two kinds of fear in this world. The kind people conjure up to scare each other to sleep, and the kind resting deep within the human heart. A fear that if you get poor enough, desperate enough, and humiliated enough, simply vanishes to make room for cold, hard grit. He thought he belonged to the second kind. He didn't believe in ghosts, didn't believe in karma, didn't believe the stories the women in the neighborhood whispered while holding their children on front porches, murmuring about the burned house at the end of the dirt road where the wind blowing through the blackened window frames sounded like a man hissing through his teeth. Nor did he believe in the evasive glances when someone accidentally mentioned Mrs. Turner and her son Victor, two names buried under ash in a night so violently ablaze it felt as if someone had flipped the sky upside down, pouring out a light that was both blinding and filth. He only believed in land, in property deeds, in property lines, in signatures, in the simple fact that if the living are greedy enough, they will always be stronger than the dead. Everything started from there, quietly, ordinarily, just like a rotting seed sprouting right where people thought they had planted a plan for a new life. Mr. Higgins was hospitalized when the last days of the hot season draped over the village, carrying a heavy, suffocating heat like a wet blanket pressed against the chest. The old man aged faster than anyone anticipated. Just a few months prior, he had been walking to the end of the alley with his cane, coughing as if tearing his throat apart. Yet now he lay curled up on a white bed with cold metal rails. His cheekbones were hollowed out as if someone had scooped out his insides, but his cloudy eyes still held an irritating sharpness, as if despite his rotting body his mind simply refused to let go. Trent hated that look more than anything. It made him feel as though everything he kept hidden had been seen long ago. He came to the hospital to care for him, bringing porridge, towels, and the rare soft voice he only used when he needed to win over the dying. Out in the hallway people praised his devotion, marveling at his decency, remarking how rare it was to find a man nowadays willing to run back and forth to the hospital for an old man who wasn't even blood relation. He would listen, bow his head, and offer a faint, modest smile, while inside his mind was as flat and still as a windless pond. He knew they saw his broad shoulders, his steady hands, his patience. What they didn't see were the numbers constantly rearranging themselves in his head day after day. That plot of land, that house, the frontage wasn't perfectly beautiful, but it was enough to flip for a profit later. The place where, if he could just gather the papers and push a few steps forward, he would never have to bow his head to anyone ever again. Anna understood him better than anyone, and because of that, she was both terrified of and drawn into the dark gravity inside him. She wasn't inherently cruel. She was just exhausted, tired of a life where waking up meant hearing the sound of death, noon meant the sound of mockery, and night meant the sound of her own heavy sigh. When Trent first brought up the land, she stayed quiet. When he began calculating how Mr. Higgins was losing his mind, she remained quiet. When he mentioned the burned house, how no one had dared go near it for years, the messy paperwork, the superstitious tongues of the neighbors, she looked away. But she didn't object. That very silence was the first rope tightening around both their necks, though neither of them felt it at the time. They still slept in the same bed, still whispered about the future, still painted a picture of a life that was lighter, brighter, and cleaner than the one they had, as if taking just one more dirty step would naturally wash everything spotless. Derek appeared like the kind of guy every village has at least one of. Quick eyes, quick hands, quick mouth. Standing outside the fray but able to sniff out the scent of money before anyone else. He had a smile that never quite reached his eyes, a very polite nod. Yet every sentence he spoke felt like it was slipping through a narrow crack in the door, probing to see what the house was hiding. Derek wasn't close to Trent in a friendly way, but close enough to drink together. Close enough to exchange words too dangerous to say out loud. People like Derek always made others feel smarter, calmer, simply because he rarely jumped in too early. He liked standing back and watching, liked holding a card in his hand until the very moment someone else thought they had won. Because of that, Trent respected him in a deeply uncomfortable way. Respected him but didn't trust him. Trusted him just enough to use him. Those two feelings mixed together into a thick mud. The further he stepped in, the deeper he sank. All the rumors about the burned house dated back 4 years, or maybe 7, or sometimes even longer, depending on who was telling the story. The details shifted every time they passed through someone's mouth, but 3 facts never changed. That night there was fire. Mrs. Turner died, Victor died, and when they broke down the door, the smell inside wasn't just the smell of normal smoke, it was sweet, scorched, and metallic. The neighbors avoided talking about it. Those who went away and came back added their own spices to the tale. Children were warned that if they stayed out running in the streets at night, the charred Mrs. Turner would drag them away. Women walking past that plot of land at dusk usually pulled their masks up a little higher, even when no one was around. The strange thing was no one could actually remember the last time someone had stood in front of that house for very long. It was like a piece of coal left forgotten on the edge of life, no longer blazing, no longer touched, but no one could be entirely sure the fire inside was completely dead. Trent had gone there alone one late afternoon, when the wind from the field swept through weeds that had grown past his knees. The iron gate was rusted, one side sagging heavily from corroded hinges. The front wall still bore black streaks, looking as though giant fingers had dragged themselves from the inside out. The windows were glassless. Inside was a pocket of darkness, not deeply black, but enough to swallow a person's gaze. He stood there longer than he intended to, not out of fear, but because of a very strange sensation, as if the house wasn't physically abandoned. It felt like a place someone was holding their breath to maintain. He sneered at himself and kicked a broken brick onto the porch. The sound of the brick hitting the floor didn't echo. It was swallowed whole. That feeling made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up for exactly one heartbeat before vanishing. When his phone buzzed, a text from Anna asking what to eat for dinner, he turned away immediately, cursing his own stupidity for standing so long in front of a pile of burnt bricks. But from that night on, he started dreaming. At first they were just fragments. The sound of someone's footsteps on damp tiles, a very faint shadow standing at the end of the hallway, neither stepping forward nor retreating, the smell of smoke. Not the pungent smoke of burning straw or pelting plastic, but a sickeningly rich smoke that seemed to slip over his tongue and cling to his throat. Some nights he jolted awake feeling the soles of his feet wet, only to touch the mattress and find it perfectly dry. Some nights he heard a sound out in the yard, like someone dragging something heavy across the dirt. When he went out to look, there was only dead silence. Anna asked him what was wrong. He cursed it vaguely, blaming the heat in his body. In his mind it was simple: think too much, dream weird things, that's it. When Mr. Higgins took a turn for the worse, the dreams began to take a clearer shape. In the dream, there was always a dimly lit room, always someone lying motionless on a bed, and always a patch of darkness right behind him that he knew with absolute certainty he should not turn to look at. The strangest thing was that he had never seen the face of whatever was standing behind him, yet he was sure it wasn't a stranger, not something from far away. It felt like someone who had been here a long time, patiently waiting for him to make one final move. The day Mr. Higgins said he wanted to amend the land deeds, Trent remembered very clearly how the light in the hospital room was sickeningly gray. It wasn't raining, but the clouds pressed hard against the glass, making everything neither bright nor truly dark. The old man was breathing heavily, each word pinned down to the bottom of his lungs before half breaking free. "That land is not for sale," he spoke slowly, his eyes not looking at Trent but at a spot just above his shoulder. "That house, no one touches it." His voice was as raspy as sand. Trent smiled softly, leaning in closer, pushing a cup of water toward him. "I didn't say anything about selling, Uncle. You're thinking too much." Mr. Higgins didn't take the water. His veiny hand rested on the blanket, trembling ever so slightly. "Don't think I don't know what you're doing." The words slipped out, not loud, not forceful, but enough to stiffen the corners of Trent's mouth. He lowered his eyes for exactly 1 second, then looked up with his familiar gentle face. "You're weak, Uncle. Sick people tend to think the worst of others. Let's leave the paperwork for when you get better." Mr. Higgins suddenly laughed, not the laugh of an angry man. It was the laugh of someone who already knew a truth that was too filthy and far too late to fix. "You're just like them." Trent froze. "Who?" The old man slowly turned his head toward the window. "The dead." Those words clung to Trent like a tiny thorn pierced right into a nerve. He stepped out into the hallway, his heart hammering heavily. Derek was standing at the end of the corridor, leaning against the wall, pretending to type on his phone. He looked up when he saw Trent walk out, simply jerking his chin upward. The two of them took the stairs instead of the elevator. On the third-floor landing, where the smell of antiseptic thinned out and the chatter of people faded, Derek finally asked. "He didn't sign?" Trent didn't answer right away. He pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and took a drag far longer than necessary. He said, "He's not selling." Derek snorted as if he already knew. Dying people usually regret all kinds of things. The problem isn't what he regrets. The problem is who's left after him. Trent turned his head. "What are you trying to say?" Derek stopped smiling. "I'm saying if things have gone this far, don't use half measures. Half measures are what get you killed." That sentence was like a hook. It doesn't push a person away immediately. It just catches hold, letting other thoughts slowly wrap themselves around. The night before Mr. Higgins died, Trent came home very late. Anna was still awake, sitting with her knees pulled to her chest on the edge of the bed. The main light turned off, the blue glow from her phone cast over her face, making her eyes look deep and exhausted. She stared at him for a long time before asking softly, "How far are you planning to go, Trent?" In the middle of taking off his shirt, he stopped. "What did you ask?" "I asked how far you're planning to go." She emphasized every word. Her voice not loud but stretched so tight it sounded like a guitar string about to snap. "The land, the house, the papers, the money, like, how far before you stop?" Trent threw his shirt onto the chair. "If you have something to say, say it straight." Anna swallowed hard. "I feel like you're not the same anymore." He gave a cold laugh. "Not the same as when? Before we were drowning in debt? Before people trampled all over us? Or before you cried because we didn't have the money to pay for your mother's hospital bills? Which before do you prefer?" She fell silent, her lips pressed into a thin white line. He stepped closer. "If you want to live clean, fine. Clean and poor, clean and cursed at, clean and bowing your head for every single dime. If you can stomach that, then go ahead. I'm tired." Anna looked up. Something resembling pure fear surfaced from the depths of her eyes. "I'm afraid you're going to do something you can't come back from." Trent stood so close he could see the pores on the bridge of her nose. "There are things I haven't been able to come back from for a long time now." He finished speaking and walked into the bathroom. The roaring sound of the water covered Anna's quiet sobbing outside, but it couldn't cover the feeling in his mind that a door was cracking open. He didn't look at it. He only continued to think about tomorrow. The next morning, the hospital had an eerie quietness, as if every sound had been muffled by wet cloth. Trent brought porridge, the paperwork, and the exhausted face of a devoted man. He had played this role for so long enough that even he occasionally forgot it was just an act. Derek didn't show his face nearby. He only sent one text, "I'm outside, call when you need me." Read it, then deleted it immediately. In the room, Mr. Higgins lay on his side, his eyes closed, the heart monitor beeping in a steady rhythm. A young nurse walked in, asked a few checking questions, and left. The atmosphere closed back in very quickly. There was only the low hum of the old air conditioner and the ticking of the clock, thin as a needle piercing the skin. Trent sat down. He stared at the old man for a long time. He waited for a surge of profound hesitation, for something that would pull his hand back, that would make him stand up and walk out, that would make him believe there was another way. But there was nothing. Only exhaustion, a knot of resentment, the feeling of being backed into a corner, and the most terrifying thought of all. If he didn't do it today, he would lose everything he had waited this deep to get. He pulled his chair closer. His hand rested on the spare pillow beside the bed before he could even put a name to the action. The fabric of the pillow was cool, soft, clean, a horrifyingly mundane object, and because it was so mundane, the final boundary looked even more fragile. Mr. Higgins opened his eyes at that exact moment. Not completely awake but not delirious either. Just a pair of dry, cloudy eyes staring quietly and directly at Trent. There was no pleading, no shock, only something very deep, very heavy, as if this old man had known all along what the bastard standing next to his bed would ultimately choose. Trent felt a sudden rush of anger boiling up because of that look. He hated being looked at as if he had already been condemned before he even acted. "Don't blame me, Uncle," he heard his own voice, so quiet it was chilling. "I'm out of options." Mr. Higgins very faintly moved his lips, the sound breaking into just one word: "Wrong." Trent didn't let him finish. The pillow came crashing down. The first few seconds were nothing like he had imagined. There was no screaming, no violent struggling, only a sudden convulsion of the body and the old man's two hands clamping onto Trent's arms with a desperate final surge of strength. He pressed down hard, gritting his teeth, his entire body weight driving into his shoulders as if he were holding down the lid of a pit that was about to blow open. The heart monitor still hadn't sounded the alarm. That detail was so bizarre that later, whenever he remembered it, Trent felt his stomach turn cold. The light above the bed suddenly flickered once, then twice. It wasn't the bright flash of an electrical short. It was like the light had just been breathed on by someone standing right next to the bulb. The temperature in the room dropped rapidly, an absurd creeping cold, the kind of cold that slips down your collar, under your arms, and into the back of your head, making the sweat on his back feel like it was freezing solid. Then Mr. Higgins opened his eyes wide beneath the pillow. Not looking at Trent, he was looking over his shoulder. His pupils trembled in a state of pure terror that Trent had never seen in a dying man. He didn't understand why in that exact moment the hair on his entire back stood on end. He knew there was something standing behind him, knew it so well that his neck went stiff. Utterly unable to turn around, he only pressed down harder. Mr. Higgins's hands digging into his arms gradually went limp, slipping down, but his eyes stayed open, still glued to the space behind Trent, as if seeing something far more horrifying than the approaching death. The heart monitor remained silently oblivious for a few more impossible beats before finally shrieking. Trent let go of the pillow, stumbled back, and gasped for air, his chest bursting as if he had just breached the surface of the water. In those 2 seconds of chaos, he had turned his head, and there was no one. Only the white wall, the IV stand, and the closed window reflecting his distorted, hunched figure. Nurses rushed in, the sound of footsteps shouting, the crash of the emergency cart racing down the hall. Trent stood frozen in place, his face drained of every drop of blood. But the moment a doctor glanced his way, he managed to twist that sheer terror into the panic of a grieving relative. He suddenly couldn't breathe, he stammered. "I just went out to get water and..." They dove into resuscitation, a mess of desperate and useless movements. Derek, somehow, was standing just outside the crowd at that moment, not close enough to be noticed, not far enough to miss what he needed. A phone held low in his jacket pocket, the lens peeking through the seam just enough to capture the angle of the hallway reflecting into the hospital room window. It wasn't complete, not the full picture, but it was enough. Derek only ever needed enough. He looked at Trent, his gaze brushing over him like a cold touch, then vanished before anyone could even remember he was there. The funeral happened much faster than the neighborhood expected. Mr. Higgins didn't have many close relatives left anyway. The crowd came mostly out of neighborly duty, out of curiosity, out of wanting to see with their own eyes who would end up with the house after the burial. Trent hustled around like an exhausted filial son. He took care of the coffin, the incense, the meals, the guests, bowing his head at the right moments, staying silent at the right times, his eyes red just enough to make anyone looking feel pity. It was exactly that flawless smoothness that started the whispering among a few neighbors. Not because they suspected anything specific. It is just that people can always feel it when a grief is performed a little too cleanly. Anna stood by the reception table, her hands ice cold despite the heat. She didn't dare look at Mr. Higgins's altar portrait for long. There was a feeling that the eyes in the picture weren't dead at all. Every time someone mentioned the burned house, the sweat would bead down her spine. The night after the funeral was the first night everything stopped letting them pretend. The entire neighborhood felt quiet after days of people coming and going. The clinking of dishes, the chanting of prayers, the gossiping of merits and sins, the broken sighs of old women sitting out in the yard. The night wind swept through the tall grass near the burned house, creating a sound like many people whispering all at once from far away. Trent sat alone in the middle room in front of the newly set altar for Mr. Higgins. The incense smoke drifted thin, curling before dissolving. He drank liquor not to get drunk but just to block the cold, hollow feeling in his chest. Since that afternoon, he hadn't stopped reminding himself that it was all over. Mr. Higgins was dead. The paperwork would be cleared sooner or later, and whatever people said would eventually blow over. Just a few more days, just keep a cool head. Just stop thinking about those final eyes. Right as he set his glass down, the altar portrait tilted ever so slightly. It didn't fall over. It was just as if someone from behind had tapped the edge of the frame. Trent sat perfectly still. Wind? There was no wind inside the house. He looked at the incense bowl. The stump of an incense stick that had just gone out suddenly glowed red, then flared into a bizarre small blue flame at the tip of the ash. The skin on his arms broke out in goosebumps. Damn it! He stood up abruptly and stepped forward to adjust the photo. The moment his finger touched the frame, he froze. On the glass, right over the collar in the picture, a dark red stain was seeping out very slowly, thick, heavy, drawing a thin line down to the corner of the frame. He blinked hard. The stain was still there. The metallic smell was faint but distinct. He stumbled back, his heart pounding against his ribs. Anna! His voice rang out way too loud, totally raw. Anna! Anna ran in, her face turning pale when she saw him pointing at the picture. But when she looked, the glass only reflected the oil lamp and both their faces. There was no red stain. "You're drunk," she said, but her voice was weaker than the person she was trying to calm. Trent was about to curse when a footstep echoed from the front porch. One step, two steps, slow, even, like someone walking in wet sandals on a tiled floor. They both snapped their heads toward the door. Not a soul in sight. The footsteps continued for 3 more beats, then stopped right at the threshold, the darkest spot between inside and out. Anna gripped Trent's arm so hard it hurt. He threw her hand off and lunged out onto the porch. The yard was totally empty. Further out was the uneven dirt patch leading to the burned house, as solidly black as the mouth of a well. He stood there for a very long time, listening to the blood thumping in his ears. Something in this night was no longer a dream. Derek was in his rented room nearly a kilometer away. He locked the door, pulled the curtains, poured a small glass of liquor, and only then took out his phone. Since that day at the hospital, he hadn't watched the video again. Not out of fear. He always prided himself on not being a coward. He just liked letting something valuable sit untouched for a while, like a man burying money in the ground waiting for it to accrue interest. In his mind, he knew he was holding a knife right against Trent's throat. Seeing Trent handling the funeral today, seeing Anna as green as a leaf, he could practically smell the cash. He played the video, skipping to the exact part reflecting through the hospital window glass. The angle was slightly shaky, the image blurry, but Trent was still clearly visible, but said. Derek smirked. "I knew it." Then the smile died completely. At first, the clip was just that. Trent leaning down, his arms pressing hard, the bed shaking faintly, the lights flickering. But when Derek dragged the progress bar forward a few more seconds, he saw that in the darkness behind Trent's back, something new had appeared. It wasn't a compression glitch. It wasn't the shadow of the curtain. A human figure, very tall, very dark, standing motionless exactly against the blank wall. Its body was so charred that there was no clear boundary between hair, face, and clothing, like a torso that had just stepped out of a fire, but the fire hadn't fully died, still smoldering beneath the cracked skin. Derek pressed his face close to the screen. His throat was bone dry. "What the hell?" he rewound. The figure was still there, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just standing behind Trent as if it had been standing there since before the video even started. Then it turned its head. No sudden jerks, no fast movements so agonizingly slow that every slight shift of that charred neck carried a horrifying intent. The face gradually angled toward the lens. One half of its face was entirely gone, like wax melted and congealed crookedly. The left eye socket was sunken deep, hollow as a black hole sucking in all the light. The other eye opened wide, revealing a milky white pupil that didn't just look through the camera but stared directly at the present-day Derek watching it. The glass of liquor slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. The phone shook violently in his grip even though there was no incoming call. Derek threw it onto the bed like it was burning his flesh. The screen went pitch black. 3 seconds later, it lit up on its own. The video kept playing even though Derek hadn't touched it, and now it didn't stop where the original clip was supposed to end. The duration bar stretched out right before his eyes as if someone had just appended a segment that had never been filmed. The image was still the hospital room. Trent had let go of the pillow, stumbling back, panting on the bed. Mr. Higgins lay motionless, but behind Trent, the blackened figure stepped to the side, revealing two other figures slowly materializing from the shadows like air bubbles rising from the bottom of murky water. A woman with scorched long hair, her jaw deformed but her silhouette still holding the soft curves of a woman. A skinny young man, his neck twisted sharply to the side as if it had been snapped, and between those two Mr. Higgins himself, not the corpse on the bed, but a hazy standing figure, still wearing the patient gown, his eyes wide open, his face an ashen gray. The three shadows stood in a row, not speaking, not moving for a very long time, and then all at once, they looked directly at Trent. Derek felt his guts twist into knots. He lunged forward, grabbed the phone, and hit the power, but the screen went black for one heartbeat. Then it lit up again. The video was still running. The three figures began to walk soundlessly, unhurriedly. With every step, the entire frame seemed to turn colder. Panicked, Derek swiped to settings, deleted the file. A notification popped up, then vanished. The video was still there. He powered off the device. The phone buzzed once and booted straight to the lock screen right in his hand. He hurled it straight at the floor. The screen shattered like a spiderweb, but the light still pierced through the cracks a sickly, demonic pale blue. From the speaker, a thin noise like wind blowing through a bamboo pipe began to static, then coalesced into something that sounded almost exactly like human breathing. Derek backed away slowly until his spine hit the wall. He had never been this terrified in his entire life. It wasn't the fear of getting caught, wasn't the fear of dying. It was a fear shaped by the sudden realization that something had been watching him from beyond all his calculations, and it was far, far more patient. The next morning, it was Derek who made the report. He didn't show his face directly at first, an anonymous call, a message sent from a burner phone, a perfectly extracted clip, no ending, no ghostly figures. Just a reflective angle enough to plant the suspicion that Mr. Higgins's death was not natural. He thought it was the best move. Throw Trent to the police first, bleed him dry, and deal with the rest later. He didn't know that from the exact second the video deformed, he was no longer the one holding the cards. He was just the one chosen to see it first. When the police arrived, Trent was still trying to live as if nothing from last night had happened. He had stayed up all night. His eyes were red, his head pounding as if a nail were being driven into it. But his panic was tightly wrapped under a layer of irritability. By the time they asked him to come down to the station for questioning, he was even preparing to raise his voice. But the moment he saw the printed screenshot from the video in an officer's hand, the color drained entirely from his face. Not because of the evidence, but because in that blurry photo, right behind his shoulder, there was a dark blotch that he recognized with absolute certainty, even if everyone else just thought it was a visual glitch. He was led away under the heavy plastered stares of the whole neighborhood. Anna stood at the door, gripping the pillar until her knuckles turned stark white. She wanted to run after him, wanted to ask, wanted to deny it all, but her legs were planted like roots into the floor. Trent turned his head back exactly once. In that look, there was nothing left that resembled her husband. There was only vengeance, terror, and a frantic silent question. "What did you see?" The holding cell was a place Trent used to think you could survive just by being stubborn. He had already prepared his evasive answers, his tactical silences, and the indignant face of an innocent man wronged. During the day he did quite well. He denied just enough, acted annoyed just enough, keeping his testimony loose but not sharp enough to be flagged as abnormal. But on the first night, when the cell sank into a darkness mixed with the stench of unwashed bodies, dampness, iron, and stale urine, he finally understood that some places are not meant for acting. Lying on the hard wooden platform, he couldn't keep his eyes closed for long. Every time he started to drift off, the feeling that someone was standing at the end of the room jerked him away. His cellmate cursed at him for making noise. He cursed back. But closer to midnight, when everyone had fallen silent, he heard the sound of breathing right underneath his bed. At first it was very soft, like a rat rustling. Then it grew clearer, expanding into the rhythm of a chest far larger than any small animal could possess. Trent lay rigid, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The breathing didn't move, it was resting right below his back. He bolted upright, shouting loudly, kicking the wooden board. His cellmate snapped at him for waking him up. The guard on duty walked by, rapping his baton against the iron bars, telling them to shut up. No one saw anything. When he sat back down, cold sweat running down both temples, the breathing was gone. But a few minutes later, a very slow, deliberate weight pressed down on the edge of the bed, like someone had just sat down right by his feet. The wood creaked, an indentation clearly formed on the straw mat. Trent screamed, scrambling back into the corner. His cellmate fully sat up this time, swearing he was faking insanity. The guard unlocked the door and peered in, only to see Trent hugging his head, trembling like he had malaria. He tried to point at the edge of the bed, but his throat was locked tight. No one believed him. By the third day, he began to completely lose the ability to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Mr. Higgins opening his eyes beneath the pillow. But now it wasn't just Mr. Higgins. Behind the old man's shoulder was always the charred, tilted face of a woman standing far too close, her hair plastered to her scalp in wet, rotting clumps like seaweed. Behind her was a young man with a crooked neck, his mouth open but mute. They didn't try to scare him. They just stood there staring at him until he was on the absolute brink of madness from the anticipation. Only then would the dream shift. He would be lying on the hospital bed, the pillow crashing down on his face, but the hands pressing the pillow down were his own. This repeated so relentlessly that during the day he started hearing footsteps in the quiet gaps between the interrogator's questions. At first just one pair, then 3 pairs, slowly pacing in circles around him. One night, the hallway camera of the detention center caught footage of Trent, who was lying down, suddenly violently yanked toward the head of the bed, as if someone had grabbed him by the collar. He thrashed wildly, his entire body pinned against the wood, his hands clawing at the empty air above his chest as if trying to pry off an invisible weight crushing his throat. His cellmate genuinely panicked and started screaming. When the guards rushed in, the pressure vanished. On Trent's neck were clear, long parallel bruises like finger marks, but not round enough to belong to human hands. From that day on, the theory that he was faking madness became much harder to sell. People started looking at him with a mix of suspicion and dread. As for him, he had entirely stopped trying to deny anything. In his head, he was left with only a raw, primal terror. They weren't waiting for him to die, they wanted him awake to see it. Anna and Derek skipped town at almost the exact same time, but not together as planned. They still took the money, still left the village, still chose a place far enough away that acquaintances wouldn't easily spot them. But since they left, a cold, irreparable crack had formed between them. Derek avoided looking in the rearview mirror at night. Anna avoided being alone in bathrooms with mirrors. They rented a temporary small house in a strange town, with freshly painted walls that still smelled of damp mold from being empty too long. On the first night, Derek placed the cracked phone on the table like a dead animal he didn't dare throw away. He had tried tossing it into the river on the way there. 5 minutes later, it was sitting in his backpack, screen already glowing. He had no memory of retrieving it. When Anna saw the phone, her entire body went cold. "You kept it?" Derek grimaced. "You think I wanted to?" She looked at him like she was looking at something both filthy and dangerous. "You dragged everything to this point." He let out a harsh laugh. "I dragged it. Or Trent dragged it, while you stood there and watched." That sentence cut deeper than he intended. Anna's face turned ashen. "I didn't kill anyone." Derek stepped closer, lowering his voice. "No, you just stayed quiet." The silence that followed was so thick the room felt like it was shrinking. Anna turned away. "I just want to escape. Who doesn't?" Derek replied, but his voice cracked entirely, as if he himself had just heard something terrible in his own words. In the middle of the night, Anna woke up to a very light knock on her bedroom door. Not a bang, 3 rhythmic taps, evenly spaced, politely eerie. She lay perfectly still. Derek was sleeping in the front room. She waited for the knock to repeat, but instead, a man's voice spoke up from just inches outside the door. "Did you think, like, you could just stand outside?" Her entire body convulsed. It was Trent's voice, unmistakable. But Trent was in jail. She bolted upright, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't turn on the lamp. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice shattered. No one answered. There was only the sound of something dragging incredibly slowly across the floor in the hallway, like a heavy sack being pulled along. She grabbed her phone to call Derek. No one picked up. She threw the door open and rushed out. The front room was empty. The front door was still locked from the inside. Derek wasn't on the couch, wasn't in the kitchen, wasn't in the bathroom. There was only the cracked phone lying in the middle of the table, glowing in the dark room. The video was playing. Anna didn't want to look, but her eyes were dragged toward it as if glued. The scene was no longer the hospital room, it was the yard of the burned house. Pitch black sky, camera shook slightly as if held by a living, breathing person. In the middle of the yard, Trent was kneeling, not the skeletal Trent currently rotting in jail, but Trent from back home, wearing the exact same clothes he wore on the night of the funeral. His arms were forced behind his back by an invisible pressure, his head forced to bow to the dirt. In the distance, Derek in the video was slowly backing away, filming and trembling. Anna recognized him by the shape of his back, and she herself was standing near the porch, paralyzed, arms wrapped tight around her chest, her face chalk white. All three of them were there like an alternate version of a night that supposedly never happened. And behind them, stepping out from the darkness of the burned house, came three shadows. Mrs. Turner first, Victor second, Mr. Higgins in the middle. They were no longer burning in the way flames consume flesh, but as if the fire had seeped into their very architecture, so that every movement carried a smoldering red ember glowing within the blackened cracks of their body. Their faces were no longer twisted in agony, they were impossibly still, which only made it more horrifying. They stopped behind each person, one by one, not touching, not speaking. Then the screen abruptly whipped to a new angle, as if the person holding the camera had their head violently twisted. The frame crashed tightly onto Derek's face. The Derek in the video had eyes rolled entirely white, his mouth gaping wide but emitting no sound, as if his vocal cords had been strangled the moment he tried to scream. Then the video glitched into static. When the image returned, Derek had vanished from the yard. There was only the phone dropped on the ground, still pointing up at the starless black sky. From the speaker of the actual phone on the table, a long, drawn-out sigh leaked into the room, very close. Anna screamed, overturning the table. The phone hit the floor, its screen spinning to face her. On the shattered glass she saw that the reflection staring back wasn't just her. Just behind her shoulder, a woman with burnt hair stood so close she was practically touching her neck. Anna spun around instantly. The room was totally empty. But when she looked back at the screen, the face in the reflection had moved closer. Close enough for her to see the left cheek burned away to expose the jawbone underneath. She ran out of that house in her pajamas, barefoot, sprinting down the street, not daring to look back. People later said they saw a young woman running in the dead of night, crying as she ran, her mouth babbling that she hadn't touched him, she hadn't killed anyone. She only stood and watched, But by morning, no one could find her. There were only barefoot muddy tracks leading into the overgrown wasteland behind the boarding houses. Stopping dead in the dirt as if sliced off by a knife, Derek had vanished a few hours before Anna. The town intersection camera recorded him walking alone near dawn, his hair a mess, one foot wearing a sandal and the other bare, cradling the phone to his chest like an urn of ashes. He stopped at the old bridge, standing still for a very long time. There was no footage of him jumping down or climbing over the railing. There was only a patch of visual static lasting barely 3 seconds. And when the image restored, the bridge was empty. The phone was found the next morning, placed neatly on the bridge ledge, the screen facing the sky, still playing the silent video of the burnt house's yard. The police confiscated it, but the file was impossible to copy. Every time it was opened, the image altered at the very end. Some saw 3 shadows. Some saw only an empty yard with the sound of footsteps circling the camera. Some heard a voice clearly calling their own name even though the file contained 0 audio data. As for Trent, he didn't die. That was the cruelest part. He lived through day after day in the detention center in a body that increasingly withered, with eyes that increasingly ran dry. He stopped fighting, stopped arguing, stopped fabricating stories. He only begged to have the lights kept on when he slept, to be moved to a different cell, to not be left alone for too long. But the brighter it got, the clearer he saw them. Once during mealtime, he suddenly pressed his face into the corner of the wall, clasping his hands and bowing repeatedly, his lips trembling without a sound. When the guards dragged him away, on the patch of wall right where he had been staring, there were 3 streaks of black water dripping from the ceiling, stopping at exact head height. Another night he smashed his own head against the iron bars until he bled, screaming at them not to let those things stand behind him anymore. They tied him down, fearing he would kill himself. By midnight, the camera caught him tied down and immobile, suddenly lifting his head to smile. No one recognized that smile as his. It was slow, crooked, the mouth stretched far too wide, like something inside hadn't quite figured out how to operate a living human's facial muscles. 3 seconds later, he began to howl, like an animal being skinned alive. Once an investigator tried to question him again to close the file. Trent sat for a long time before managing one complete sentence. When I pressed the pillow down, like, there was someone standing behind me. The investigator thought he was trying to spin a psychiatric defense and told him to explain. Trent stared blankly at the table, his voice flat as ash. Not one person. At first it was 1, then it was 3. Who? He stayed silent for a long time, then his lips twitched. The people I thought had already left. That sentence was recorded in the transcript as a manifestation of psychological trauma following his arrest. No one used it in the final official conclusion. But the clerk who wrote that report later requested a transfer. He told his wife that ever since that day, whenever he put a pen to paper to sign anything with Trent's name on it, his hand went as cold as if submerged in ice water. The plot of land with the burned house was eventually abandoned all over again. The property deeds were entangled in disputes. The criminal case dragged on. The people involved either disappeared or lost their minds, and no one had the courage or the patience to touch it anymore. Weeds grew tall through the cracked brick foundation. During the rainy season, water pooled in the blackened crater of the yard like an unclosable eye. Children were strictly forbidden from going near it. Groups of young men who once dared each other to go shoot late-night videos only had the guts to stand outside the gate pointing their cameras in before bolting, when their batteries drained from 90 to 10% in minutes. Some said they had seen 3 people standing in a row inside the yard, staring out at the street. Some swore they could hear the faint microscopic beep of a hospital monitor on moonless nights. Some claimed that if you walked past, the charred window panes wouldn't reflect your own face, but the face of someone else standing much closer, right behind you. People told many versions of the story, but everyone agreed on one point: no one in that story truly escaped. Trent slowly lost his mind in prison, remaining alive, but his humanity had been peeled away layer by layer, leaving behind nothing but a carcass that knew how to be afraid. Derek thought he was the smartest, the one who stayed on the outside with his hands clean, but ended up being the very first one they looked at directly. Anna thought she only kept quiet, only failed to stop it, only stood on the sidelines of evil. And that sentence she heard in the middle of the night became the thing that haunted everyone who knew the story long after the fact. Did you think you could just stand outside? It didn't haunt them because it was scary in a cheap, ghostly way, but because inside it lay a truth so filthy the living could barely swallow it. There are sins that do not begin with the hand. They begin with seeing and choosing to stand perfectly still. Years later, if anyone was foolish enough to stand in front of the burned house on a night when the wind hung low, they might see the part of the story that few dared to tell in full. Not a vision of ghosts manifesting in blue fire or howling screams out of some cheap thriller, just images that were incredibly slow, incredibly silent, and incredibly mundane in the most horrific way possible. A man kneeling on the ground as if pressed down by an invisible weight. A bit further away, a guy holding a phone backing away without daring to turn around. Near the porch, a woman standing paralyzed, her hands gripped together so tightly her knuckles were white. And behind them, from the thick impenetrable darkness of a house that had never known peace, 3 shadows stood. They no longer needed to step forward. They no longer needed to touch. They simply stayed exactly as they had stayed since the first night of the fire, since the night the pillow crashed down, since the exact moment the door cracked open, and none of the living realized they had just crossed a boundary with no way back. They thought they killed a man to change their lives. They thought the dead just needed to be buried, and that would be the end of it. That if you just padlocked the neighbors' mouths, padlocked the paperwork, padlocked the memories, everything would lie still. But there are deaths that refuse to end. There are eyes that after closing for the final time no longer look at the world the way the living do. And what remains after everything is not justice, not peace, not tears of repentance. It is only a patch of darkness that tightly holds onto every single person who has ever stepped through it, crushing them slowly, making sure they live long enough to understand that there are some things in this world that do not haunt people, they keep them.